Hi everyone, it's Professor Dan here, welcoming you to another edition of Professor Dan's more well-coiffed upper torso talks to you about different topics in ethics. Ethics, that course that somebody told you you had to take. Today we're going to talk about one of the more important figures in the history of ethics, a fellow by the name of Kant. Now, I first studied philosophy my senior year in high school, which was a long time ago. So long ago that not only were some of you not born, but maybe some of your parents were even just in elementary school, and that makes me sad. So, thanks for that. Anyway, my senior year in high school, my philosophy class, we ended the year talking about Kant. And I remember I was riding the bus because I had ruined the engine of the car that I had owned, because I'm a philosopher and not a mechanic. And I was riding the bus, and there was a girl who was in the philosophy class with me, and I spent the last month or so of the school year attempting to explain Kant to her, and I don't think I ever really actually succeeded. So Kant, in contrast to utilitarianism, we usually like to pair Kant and utilitarianism because they're opposite kinds of moral theories. For Kant, it's not about the outcome, it's about the intention. Right? What's the will which produces the act? Kant wants to determine how we can know before we take an action whether or not an action is going to be morally good or morally bad, regardless of how it turns out. So we can know beforehand, for Kant, the moral worth of an action, even if we never actually take any action at all. For Kant, it's important to locate the moral worth of the action here because I am, it turns out, free with respect to my will. I can do or not do a thing. I can will or not will a thing. And because of that, that's where I'm going to locate the moral worth of the action. So Kant, after he spends some time, and I'm not going to really talk about the whole hypothetical and categorical imperative thing and all the duty and stuff like that. You can read all that sort of stuff on your own if you want. What I want to talk about in particular is something he calls, and I'll use some different colors for those of you who are visual learners. For Kant, the basic rule of morality is something called the categorical imperative. And a lot of times when we talk about the categorical imperative, we capitalize it so you know that it's the important categorical imperative and not some lesser categorical imperative with lowercase letters. The categorical imperative is the fundamental rule from which all other moral actions spring. And it comes in two basic variations. There is what we call the first formulation, which is to act such that the maxim of your will can be a universal law for all rational beings. And there is what's actually the third. We also call this the practical version, which says that you cannot treat human beings as means to an end. You have to treat humans as ends in themselves. And I want to now unpack what each one of these things mean. So Kant says that whenever I will an action, it has to be a universal law that applies to everyone. Now, people, when they see the term universal, a lot of people start getting confused very quickly. So they say, well, what does universal mean? Maybe what you think is universal is not what I think is universal, and what about exceptions to the universal rule and all this other sort of stuff? Or what if everybody thought the same thing was right and was actually wrong and all that other sort of stuff? And what Kant says is that universal is not a matter of my opinion, it's a matter of logical consistency. And this is something a lot of people get stuck on. Even people who are good philosophers, they'll say, well, an act is universal if anyone would accept that act. And that's not really quite what Kant is saying, and we'll explain that in more detail momentarily. Universal means that whatever your action is, it does not lead to a contradiction. If it leads to a contradiction, it can't be universal, and therefore you can't do that act, or you can't do it and have it be morally good. No one ever said you couldn't do morally bad things. If you could not do morally bad things, we wouldn't need to have these ethics classes at all now, would we? So if an action does not lead to a contradiction, then it's universal. And anybody should be able to think this out. So, for example, if I wanted to say, well, can I universalize, say, telling a lie? Well, no, I can't universalize telling a lie, because if I tell a lie, I contradict the principle of language, which is to convey accurate information, and a lie is the intentional conveying of inaccurate information, and therefore is contradictory. More on that later as well. The practical formulation, or the third formulation, is that you have to treat people as an end in themselves and not as a means to an end. And so this comes about, it actually follows from this version, because remember we said earlier that Kant believes that humans, that is rational beings, are what we call free. Because we have a will, so we can choose to do whatever we want or not do what we want. Freedom, according to Kant, means that we have infinite moral worth. All human beings individually have infinite moral worth. And so they have to be treated as ends in themselves, and here's why. If I treat something as a means to an end, I'm saying that the thing that I treat as a means is less important or worth less than the end. If it wasn't worth less than the end, then I wouldn't care about the end. I would just keep the means. But a human being has infinite moral worth. If I treat a human being as worth less than something else, I'm saying an infinite thing is worth less than some other thing. But an infinite thing, by definition, can't be less than another thing. And so therefore it would be a contradiction, and that means I have to treat human beings as ends in themselves. If I lie to somebody, I'm treating them as a means to an end, and so therefore that violates this formulation of the categorical imperative. I can't treat people as a means to an end. Interestingly, by the way, for those of you who have been playing with something like the trolley problem, if one human being has infinite moral worth and 5 human beings each have infinite moral worth, then which group has more moral worth? Well, what's 5 times infinity? The answer would be infinity. 5 times infinity is no more or less infinity than infinity, right? You can't have 5 times infinity, which is why you can't trade one human being for multiple human beings. For those of you who want a nice pop culture reference about this, you can look to the movie Avengers, the Infinity War, where Captain America says, we don't trade lives, when they're thinking about destroying Vision in order to save all the rest of the universe. Of course, that didn't really work out very well, but no one ever said you had to be a Kantian. Anyway, for a Kantian, you can't sacrifice one person for the benefit of other people. By the way, that includes yourself. You yourself have infinite moral worth. You cannot use yourself as a means to an end any more than anybody else can. Okay? So, there's one more important thing I like to bring up when I talk about Kant, and that is this. When we talk about having universal moral rules and not using people as means to an end, a lot of people think of something that they're familiar with, which they call the golden rule. And the golden rule, of course, is that wonderful rule that you learned as a child when you were trying to pay attention wherever they taught you this little rule. And it's do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Aren't you happy that I'm using this music room whiteboard now instead of just typing stuff on a screen? See how much more authentic this is? Anyway, the golden rule to a lot of people looks like Kant. Like Kant just made a philosophical version of the golden rule. Now, there are a lot of people, including some people who don't really have an excuse, who hold this view. Kant himself did not hold the view. In fact, Kant himself said very clearly in words written in German and then translated into English and a lot of other languages, that this and this are not the same. Okay? These things are not the same. This is not the golden rule. It's not the golden rule because in the golden rule, what do? You think about what you would want, but you're not the universal. The universal is what it is, regardless of whether you would want it or not. And you can't allow yourself to be treated as a means to an end, even if you yourself would allow that. It doesn't matter. That's not how this works, and so it's not the golden rule. Now, I like to illustrate how this is not the golden rule with an example that I call the Great Aunt Daisy example. So imagine that you have a Great Aunt Daisy. She's very old. Let's say she's like 83. She lives in an apartment with no other humans and 10 other cats. And there are two things that keep Great Aunt Daisy going. Because she doesn't have any family really other than you. She never had children. She just has all those cats. And the two things that keep her going are a television show that comes on in the sort of mid to late afternoon where an angry person screams at poor people in judgment of the problems that they have brought to her, and singing in the church choir on Sunday. And this is one of those churches that has an open choir. All you have to do is provide the robes. And it's also one of those churches where on a Sunday there will be somewhere between 7 and 27 different songs that are sung. So this is what she really loves to do. There's only one small problem with Great Aunt Daisy and her choir singing. Great Aunt Daisy is terrible at singing. Like, really bad. How bad is she? She's so bad that it sounds like somebody took a bunch of those cats from her house, put them into a sack, dumped the sack into a river, and then started hitting the sack with a baseball bat. That's what her singing sounds like. So it's not a matter of, oh, well, maybe she sounds good. No, she doesn't sound good to anyone. But because she's older and going deaf, she can't hear how bad she sounds, so she sings even louder still. Everybody in the choir is made miserable by her singing. Everybody knows she's bad at singing, except apparently her. So one day during the snack break at the church service, she comes up to you and she says, because she thinks she thought she heard some people, she says, well, wait a minute, tell me the truth. I'm good at singing, right? What are you going to say to her? Now, what you might be tempted to say is the following. Well, I know she's bad at singing, but I know if I tell her the truth, it will hurt her feelings. And it's not hard for me to imagine a situation where I might want somebody to tell me a little lie to spare my feelings. And so I'm going to tell this little lie to spare her feelings because that seems like what the golden rule would tell me to do. But here's the thing about that. For Kant, it doesn't matter whether or not you want to spare her feelings or whether her feelings are spared. Either you follow the universal rule or you don't. You can easily see on the golden rule where it would be okay to lie to her in a situation like that to spare her feelings, but that doesn't work at all for a Kantian. For a Kantian, the only moral thing you can do is tell her the truth. And that's why this is not the golden rule. Now, you might be wondering to yourself, well, wait a minute, if I tell her the truth, she's going to be very sad and probably upset with me. And that might be so. But for Kant, we're not thinking about the consequences of the action because we're not responsible for the consequences of the action because we cannot control the consequences of the action. We can only control what it is we ourselves choose to think and do. It's up to her to control her reaction. So if I say to her, you're terrible at singing, you sound like somebody's banging on a sack full of wet cats. Now, maybe I don't have to say it quite that way, but anyway, I can say to her, no, you are not good at singing, and everyone would like it if you would stop singing in this choir. She might take that very badly. We don't know. She might not have realized that and then be happy that we told her the truth and maybe she does something else. We're not responsible for her actions. We're only responsible for our own actions. That's how Kant works. So even if telling her the truth leads to a harmful outcome, we're not morally responsible for that. We're only morally responsible for what we ourselves choose to do. And if we do it following a universal law and not treating people as means to an end, because when we tell her the truth, we're not treating her as a means to an end, we're just telling her the truth. It's up to her to deal with it. If we do those things, then the actions are morally good, and if we don't, they're morally bad. Now, I want to just emphasize one last thing. Sometimes when you tell people that for Kant the consequences are not part of determining the moral worth of the action, they seem to think that means you can just do whatever you want so long as you really believe it. And that's not true. You still have to follow the universal law. You can't universalize doing bad things even if you want to, because your desires don't matter in formulating the universal law. So that's how Kant works. Now you have Kant on the one end and utilitarianism on the other end, for those of you watching all those videos. But don't worry, we'll come up with some more stuff soon. Until then, this is Professor Dan saying, see you on the boards.